The sound of my cell phone hitting the floor snapped me out of my trance. My fingers were shaking as the speakerphone still played my dad's voice in the silent office. "She's a total disappointment, Catherine. I don't even know why we still keep in touch. Avery will never be anything more than a burden to this family." I was frozen, trying to process words that were never meant for me. The accidental call had revealed a conversation between my parents that would change everything. As the voices continued, I discovered not only their contempt for me, but also their plans to demand more money. Money they never expected would come from the company I built, JSC Holdings. Ironically, while they called me a failure, I was the one who actually owned the house they lived in. And in that moment, sitting in my CEO chair, I realized it was time to rewrite this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. I grew up being told I'd never be good enough. While my brother Connor received applause for every small achievement, I ended up collecting degrees and certificates that eventually gathered dust in some drawer. My father, William, made it a point to point out every mistake I made at family dinners, turning meals into judgment sessions. I remember the day I closed my first big contract at JSC Holdings. I was so excited to share the news that I went straight to my parents' house. I found my mom in the kitchen as usual, pretending not to hear my dad's acidic comments. "Probably got that contract out of pity," he said, without even looking up from his newspaper. Catherine, my mother, simply adjusted the flower arrangement on the table, her silent way of agreeing with everything. It was that same week that I received a call from my Uncle Robert. He warned me that my parents were about to lose the house because of debts my father had hidden from everyone. Without a second thought, I used my savings to buy out the mortgage through JSC Holdings. I set up a complex scheme, with help from Christopher, my financial advisor, so they would never know that I was the true owner of the property. For 3 years I kept that secret. I watched silently as they made monthly payments to my company, completely unaware that the failure was actually their creditor. I continued seeking scraps of their approval, attending every family meeting, enduring every mean comment, all the while secretly holding the roof over their heads. The conversation I overheard on the phone was the final straw. After years of keeping up appearances and supporting my parents' home, I decided to exercise my legal rights over the property. I spent the whole night reviewing documents with Christopher, who had always warned me about the emotional risks of keeping this secret arrangement. "You have full legal backing," he explained, spreading the papers out on my desk. "Just wait until they miss a payment, and JSC Holdings can start the foreclosure process." The plan was simple, but the weight of the decision was overwhelming. It wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was the end of decades of trying to prove my worth. I set up a meeting with my Uncle Robert, the only one who'd ever been by my side. He welcomed me into his office where I used to hide when things got tough at home. "You don't owe them anything, Avery," he said, holding my trembling hands. "They chose this path when they decided to use you for money." The following weeks were spent preparing every detail. I transferred important documents to a safe, beefed-up security at my apartment and instructed my assistant to filter every call from my parents. Christopher put together a legal team to deal with any potential backlash, especially from Connor, who would surely try to intervene with his legal connections. The hardest part was keeping my composure during company meetings, knowing that soon I'd be seen as the daughter who had kicked her own parents out. But every time I hesitated, I remembered the words I heard during that accidental call, the contempt in their voices, the plans to extort more money from me. One afternoon, while sitting in my office, I signed the final documents. I looked out the window at the city skyline that I now truly called home. I wasn't the little girl desperate for approval anymore. I was a businesswoman about to close her most important transaction, my own liberation. The strategy was set. It was only a matter of waiting for the right moment to reveal that the disappointing daughter was really the one who had been holding up the roof all along. The monthly family dinner arrived faster than I expected. Sitting at the same table as always, I watched the ritual that had repeated for years. My mother served the food with that nervous smile. Connor bragged about his latest achievements at the law firm, and my father directed everything with a disapproving look. "Avery, we heard that JSC Holdings is expanding," my father began, in a tone that was falsely casual. I kept my face neutral, even though I knew exactly where this conversation was headed. "Your brother mentioned you closed million-dollar deals last month." Connor jumped in, his voice laced with malice. "Actually, Dad, it was several deals. Our little sister finally learned how to make money." The way he stressed "make money" made my stomach churn. They had no idea how much I knew about their intentions. "Dear," my mother started, her restless hands adjusting the silverware, "your dad and I are thinking about renovating the house. The roof needs repairs and, well," she glanced at William, seeking his support. "We need $50,000, my father finished curtly. "Consider it your way of repaying everything we've done for you." I tasted bitter irony. They'd been living in my property for years, and now they wanted more money to fix up a house that was technically mine. I watched the way they exchanged glances, clearly expecting me to cave in like always. "I can't help," I replied calmly, cutting a piece of meat. The ensuing silence was deafening. "What do you mean you can't help?" Connor intervened, his voice rising. "Everyone knows you're well off." My father slammed his hand on the table, making the plates tremble. "After everything we sacrificed for you, is this how you repay us?" I held my composure, remembering the words I overheard on that accidental call. Every accusation, every manipulation now seemed so transparent. I stood up calmly, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. "You'll be hearing from me soon," was all I said before leaving them stunned by my first refusal in years. The following Monday, I executed the first phase of the plan. Christopher confirmed that the monthly mortgage payment hadn't come through. As expected, my dad was testing my refusal to attend dinner, probably hoping I'd cave in and send the money they asked for. I instructed our legal team to send the first default notice. The document, bearing the JSC Holdings logo, was delivered by a court officer. I could already picture my father's expression when he got that formal envelope, his arrogance turning into concern as he read the legal terms. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. First there were messages from my mother, filled with crying emojis and dramatic pleas. Then came Connor's veiled threats, mentioning how terrible it would be if certain rumors about JSC Holdings got out. Finally, furious calls from my dad, which I continued to ignore. In the third week of delay, I sent the final notice. The document detailed the entire property history, including the transfer of the mortgage to JSC Holdings 3 years ago. I attached a formal letter explaining that due to their failure to meet the contractual terms, the company would begin the foreclosure process. The bomb finally went off on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in a meeting when my assistant alerted me that William and Catherine had stormed the building's lobby, demanding to see me. I took a deep breath, adjusted my blazer, and went downstairs to confront them. "How could you do this to us?" my mother screamed, tears streaming down her face. "We're your family." My father stepped toward me, pointing his finger at my face. "So this is it? All this time you were the owner of our house? You ungrateful manipulator." I kept my voice steady, aware of the security guards watching the situation closely. "Yes, I bought the mortgage when you were about to lose everything. I kept you in your house for 3 years while you treated me like a failure." "You can't do this," my father growled. "You have no right." "I have all the legal rights," I interrupted. "JSC Holdings is the rightful owner of the property, and you've violated the contractual terms." Connor appeared shortly after, waving papers and threatening lawsuits. But Christopher had already prepared all the necessary documentation. Every transaction, every document was legally sound and fully registered. "You have 30 days to vacate the property," I announced, surprising even myself with my calm. "Any further communications will be made through our attorneys." I watched as security escorted them out of the building. My mother sobbed, my father shouted threats, and Connor promised to ruin my reputation. But for the first time, their words no longer held any power over me. Back in my office, I sat in my chair and allowed a few silent tears to fall, not from sadness, but from relief. The weight of years of emotional manipulation was starting to lift. The property I had used to try to buy their love was now the instrument of my freedom. In the following weeks, the family pressure reached unbearable levels. Uncle Robert warned me that my mother was spreading a dramatic story to the whole family about how her poor little girl had been corrupted by power and money. On social media, she shared indirect messages about ingratitude and the true meaning of family. Catherine began showing up at my building almost daily, always crying and begging to talk. "You can't do this to your own mother," she would say in tears to anyone willing to listen. "I carried that girl for 9 months in my womb." The security guards had to be instructed not to let her in, which only added to her dramatic display. My dad's tactics were different. He alternated between veiled threats and manipulation attempts through mutual acquaintances. Several colleagues came to me, saying that William had reached out, concerned about my emotional state and my ability to lead the company. "Your daughter is clearly having a nervous breakdown," he would tell everyone. "We need to intervene before she destroys everything she's built." It was his way of trying to cast doubt on my sanity and professional competence. Meanwhile, Connor mobilized his legal contacts. I received subpoenas for various lawsuits, all based on absurd accusations. He claimed everything from family fraud to workplace harassment, attempting to tarnish my reputation in every possible way. One afternoon, I found my mother sitting at a cafe in front of my office, showing old photos of me to a local reporter. "She used to be such a sweet girl," I heard her say between sobs. "I don't know what happened to my little girl." Christopher had to call in our press team to contain any potential damage. The final straw came when I discovered that my father had contacted board members of the company. In a desperate move, he insinuated that I was misappropriating corporate funds for personal revenge. An extraordinary meeting was called, during which I presented all the legal documentation to clarify the situation. At home, letters kept arriving. Handwritten notes from my mother, reminiscing about moments from my childhood. Old photos with emotional messages scrawled on the back. Even my old teddy bear showed up at my doorstep, along with a dramatic letter about how I was killing my mother with sorrow. Uncle Robert visited me regularly, worried about the emotional toll of it all. "They're desperate," he said one night as we read another threatening letter from my father. "Desperate people are capable of anything." He was right. Every day new attempts were made to force me to back down. Anonymous calls, manipulative messages, emotional blackmail. It was a constant test of my resolve. But every new attempt at manipulation only reinforced that I had made the right decision. Every fake tear from my mother, every threat from my father, every legal maneuver from Connor, it all confirmed the toxic pattern I was finally breaking free from. The most aggressive move from William came during a crucial meeting with international investors. In the middle of my presentation, he burst into the conference room clearly agitated. "This is the real Avery," he shouted, throwing manipulated photos and forged documents onto the table that suggested I behaved badly. Security quickly removed him, but the damage was done. I spent the next several hours explaining the situation to the investors, exposing the truth about the family conflict, and providing proof of JSC Holdings' integrity. Christopher stayed by my side, backing every word with solid evidence. The next day, Connor launched a defamation campaign on social media. He posted a series of statements claiming that I had stolen our parents' house through corporate manipulations. Fortunately, our legal team had already prepared a response, presenting the complete timeline of events along with proof of the legality of every transaction. My father wouldn't give up. I found out that he was systematically contacting our top clients, trying to cast doubt on the company's stability. On every call, he pitched himself as a concerned father, insinuating that I was misusing corporate resources. The situation called for even harsher preventive measures. I implemented new security protocols at the office. All key meetings now had extra security. I instructed our legal team to document every attempt at defamation and to prepare the appropriate actions. On one particularly tense morning, I received an anonymous email with supposed evidence of irregularities at JSC Holdings. It was an amateur attempt at blackmail, clearly orchestrated by Connor. The proof was a set of poorly forged documents, which our lawyers quickly dismantled. Catherine also ramped up her attacks, but in a more subtle way. She started attending corporate events where she knew I would be, always ready to create a scene. At one event, she even pretended to faint when she saw me, causing unnecessary embarrassment. Uncle Robert warned me about rumors that William was planning something bigger. He's been talking to investigative journalists, he told me. He wants to turn this into a public scandal. Anticipating this, I organized a press conference. With Christopher and our legal team, I presented all the relevant documentation. The legal purchase of the mortgage, years of payments, extortion attempts, threats. I turned his attempt to expose me into a demonstration of corporate transparency. The lowest point came when I discovered that my father had hired a private investigator to dig into my personal life. The guy was caught trying to bribe JSC Holdings employees for compromising information. Every attack demanded a calculated professional response. I couldn't afford to react emotionally. While they played dirty, I kept everything within legal bounds, documenting every move and building a solid case that only justified my decision to permanently cut ties. The war they started had the opposite effect of what they intended. Instead of weakening me, every new attack only strengthened my determination and proved that I had made the right choice. The final showdown happened on a rainy night. I was at home reviewing documents when the doorbell rang. Through the intercom, I saw my parents and Connor drenched from the rain. I thought about not answering, but something told me that it was time to end it once and for all. When I opened the door, my mother rushed to hug me, but I stepped back. William entered uninvited, his gaze sweeping over my apartment with disdain. Connor stood at the doorway, holding a folder that I assumed contained more legal threats. "So this is where the big shot lives," my father began, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You built all of this while planning to destroy us?" "Don't twist things," I replied, keeping my distance. "You know exactly why we're in this mess." My mother launched into her usual theatrics. "How can you do this to us, after everything we sacrificed for you?" Her tears seemed rehearsed as always. Sacrifices? For the first time, I let anger seep into my voice, like the sacrifices of humiliating me at every dinner, of making me feel like a failure even when I was saving you from bankruptcy. Connor stepped forward, waving his papers. "We have proof that you planned this from the start. The mortgage purchase, the payments, it was all a trap." "A trap?" I laughed without humor. "You were about to lose everything. I saved that house. I kept you there for years while you kept treating me like trash." "You never had that right," my father exploded, his face red with anger. "That house is ours." "No, it isn't," I replied calmly, picking up my phone. "And you know what's ironic? I have a very interesting recording here of you two discussing how you were going to blackmail me for more money." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother stopped crying instantly. Connor dropped his papers. My father's face went pale. "It's over," I declared, heading for the door. "You have 1 week to leave the house. If you don't, the police will be involved. And if you try anything else against me or my company, this recording and all the documents I have will end up exactly where you don't want them." "You wouldn't do that," my mother whispered, finally showing her true self. "We're your family." "Family?" I looked each one in the eyes. "Family doesn't manipulate. Family doesn't destroy. Family doesn't blackmail. You're just people who shared the same roof with me for years, sucking everything dry." William tried to land one final blow. "You'll regret this. No one will trust someone who treats their own family like that." "No," I replied, opening the door. "The only regret I have is not doing this sooner. Now get out of my apartment." One by one, they left. Connor was the last, stopping at the door to stare at me. "You're no better than us," he said. "No," I agreed, "just smarter, and finally free." I closed the door and collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but relieved. Outside, I heard their footsteps fading away, taking with them decades of manipulation and abuse. Eviction day arrived with a strange sense of finality. From my car, I watched as the court officer and the removal team arrived at the house. My parents had already taken most of their belongings, leaving behind only old furniture and decades of bitter memories. Catherine and William came out for the last time, carrying a few final boxes. My mother glanced around the neighborhood, probably worried about what others would think. My father maintained his rigid posture, but his slumped shoulders betrayed his defeat. Connor didn't show up. I later heard he was busy looking for a new apartment for them. The court officer handed me the keys and the final documents. As I signed the papers, I saw my parents' car pulling away in the rearview mirror. There were no shouts, no drama, no last-ditch manipulation attempts. Just a heavy silence that carried the weight of a story coming to an end. I stepped into the empty house one last time. The rooms that once echoed with criticism and disapproval were now silent. In my old bedroom, I found some forgotten photos in a drawer. In every one of them, I was smiling, desperately trying to please, seeking approval that would never come. In the kitchen, where I had heard countless times that I wasn't good enough, I found the old family picture frame. It showed what looked like a perfect family, at least on the surface, but now I could clearly see the cracks behind those smiles. I gathered the last important documents and locked the door. The real estate agent was already on the way to discuss selling the property. The house that had long been the prison of my insecurities would soon be just another address in my business portfolio. I got into my car and took one last look at the place I once called home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the lawn, where so many emotional battles were fought. It was time to move on. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. The house sold in record time. With the money from the sale, I set up the New Beginning Foundation, dedicated to helping women who face emotional and financial abuse in their families. It's ironic that the property that once imprisoned me is now helping to free others. I haven't kept in touch with my family. Occasionally, I hear from Uncle Robert. I learned that my parents moved to a smaller apartment in another state. Connor is still trying to rebuild his reputation in the legal world. Catherine sometimes sends messages on holidays, but I've learned to leave them unanswered. JSC Holdings grew even more after the whole ordeal, perhaps because I finally freed myself from the burden of trying to prove my worth to people who would never appreciate me. Christopher jokes that freeing me from the past was my best investment. In my office, I keep a small photo of myself as a child, not to remember the hard times, but to show that scared little girl that she made it, that she's stronger than anyone ever imagined, that she doesn't need anyone's approval to shine. Some people ask if I regret it, if it wasn't too harsh to kick my own family out of the house. I answer that true family isn't about making you feel small. They don't manipulate you, they don't despise you. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is realizing that some bridges need to be burned so we can build our own path. Today, when I look out the window of my office, I no longer see shadows of the past. I only see the future I built for myself, a future free from manipulation, blackmail, and false affection, a future that is entirely my own. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this.